Okay, these headlines from a little while back are not really the best headlines, I think. But what they were talking about were jokes and riddles that were recently translated that had never been found before from ancient Mesopotamia. Some were crude, and so that's why they're kind of these joke headlines like the oldest Yo Mama joke. Not exactly the best headline again, but for example, in your mouth and your teeth. This is a riddle. Constantly stared at you. The measuring vessel of your Lord. What is it? Beer. Right? So obviously there are things that are lost in translation. You can see some of the different. Here's the one that relates to mother. Of your mother is by the one who has intercourse with her. Who is it? The answer was broken off, so we'll never know the answer to that joke and or riddle. Also, a few years back, this was about 7 years ago, 2014. Interesting story. A man brought a cuneiform tablet to Irving Finkel at the British Museum and showed it to him. He said his father had purchased it in Iraq during World War II. The father was an officer or an airman in the Royal Air Force, and in one of the markets in Baghdad, bought a cuneiform tablet. Stayed in the family. Finally, this guy brought it to Irving Finkel to have a look at it. And Irving Finkel started to read it and realized that it was a version of the flood story. But what was interesting is it had details that were not in any other version of the flood story. Specifically, it had instructions to the Utnapishtim character on how to actually build the boat to take the animals and his family and save them from the great flood. So he was, of course, very excited, and he ended up writing a book about this tablet. It's now part of the British Museum. But the book is called The Ark Before Noah. If you're interested, you can find it. Really, almost every library will have it on as an ebook or a physical book. And it's a good introduction also to ancient Mesopotamian tablets. So the text reads wall, wall, reed wall, reed wall. He's building the boat out of bundled reeds, like we talked about in southern Mesopotamia. Destroy your house, build a boat, despise possessions, and save life. So interesting. And the ancient Babylonian text describes the boat as being round, not the sort of, the shape that we would expect or that we're used to today for boats. It's essentially a coracle, or like some of those reed boats I showed you on the Tigris and the Euphrates in Iraq in the early 19th century. It had two levels and a roof. And Irving Finkel even had a documentary made about this where they built a replica of the boat and launched it. It was pretty interesting. So there's always things that are turning up as they are doing new analyses of some of these old tablets. For example, not that long ago, there was a tablet that's talked about Babylonians tracking Jupiter and having kind of advanced mathematics in order to do so. There was a debate recently about whether the ancient Babylonians knew trigonometry. There's debate about that because they found a table on a cuneiform tablet, but it may not actually be a trigonometry table. That is, they didn't know how to necessarily calculate, the hypotenuse of a triangle, but they could estimate it based on proportions that were on a table. So they weren't necessarily calculating it, but sort of using a reference guide to figure it out, right? And here you can see the article that was about Babylonian astronomy. We also, Samuel Noah Kramer outlined the first medical text, the first farmer's almanac, the first animal fables, the first library catalog, and the first dictionaries. Right? And you get an idea of some of the techniques that we already looked at. We saw school tablets. This is an example of a mathematics tablet, right? Which is it's a multiplication table for the number 13. So lots and lots of tablets of different sorts that give us an insight into all aspects of life in ancient Mesopotamia, or not all aspects, but many varied aspects of life. Okay, now let's look at a site called Ebla. Ebla is a very important excavation. It's still being excavated. It started in the 1970s with an Italian project that's still going on. This is a third millennium city, and it gives us insight into how cities were developing, not only in northern Mesopotamia, but we would say this is kind of part of the Levant here, sort of the fringe of northern Mesopotamia and the Levant. So after the Uruk period, we said that there was kind of a downturn in the societies in northern Mesopotamia as cities started to grow, continued to grow in southern Mesopotamia. Well, cities reemerged in northern Mesopotamia, and one of these cities was Ebla, and Ebla and another nearby city called Mari, you could make the case were strong rivals in many regards of the city-states of southern Mesopotamia. Although Ebla, as we'll see, was, in terms of its culture, was very much Sumerian. Right? Okay, one of the things they found in Ebla that was so important from the early dynastic period was a palace. Right? So this is the palace of the king and queen, which contained an audience hall, an archive, a throne room, storehouses. Right? And this is part of this early Bronze Age. We're in the early Bronze Age now. Early dynastic specifically for Mesopotamia, but the whole region, we would say the early Bronze Age, urbanism that spreads. Right? So the Ebla was the main city, and it ruled over a certain territory around it. And as we said before, urbanism in northern Mesopotamia emerged and developed differently than in southern Mesopotamia, even though the culture was very similar, and there was a lot of cultural influence, especially from the south to the north. But because northern Mesopotamia was a dry farming area, they couldn't just generate huge amounts of surplus crops. They also had to generate wealth by other means, and we're going to see that with Ebla. In northern Mesopotamia, with Ebla as an example, temples were not as powerful as in southern Mesopotamia. Neither were palaces. Palaces were pretty powerful, but still not quite as powerful as in southern Mesopotamia. Political control was less centralized. Society in Ebla was more kin-based. Obviously, kings and queens were still important. There was also an assembly of elders, a little bit like what was mentioned with the early myth of Gilgamesh. And also beneath the king, he had a whole host of viziers who were in charge of administrative bodies. Some of them actually worked and lived in the palace. So Ebla, again, is up here. So this is kind of northern Mesopotamia, the Levant region. Mari was a rival, and you can see southern Mesopotamia starting over here. The excavations in the 70s and 80s yielded this very large palace from the early dynastic, from the early Bronze Age, and several rooms were excavated. There was an archive room, living spaces, a courtyard, a throne room. Many of these have been identified from the artifacts and the cuneiform tablets that have been found, as well as the main archive of the palace. So this is showing some of the areas, like the steps that would lead from the lower portion up to the second story. The archive room was on the lower portion. That's one of the things we're going to look at next. It was also a large processing facilities for food to feed the entire palace system, all the people that worked in the palace. One of the differences between the palace of Ebla and palaces in southern Mesopotamia was that the palace in Ebla, the architecture was quote-unquote more approachable. It wasn't fortified or cordoned off from the rest of the city. there was again that courtyard at the entrance that made it seem slightly more welcoming to dignitaries and things like that. The archive room was over here, and you can see the different kinds of tablets that were also found in other parts of the palace. Many of the tablets deal with the economy of the palace, how they made their wealth and the keeping track of that wealth. You could also see lists of jars of wine. Ebla is in the Levant, so this is where grapes can grow, also where olives can grow. So they would have olive oil and they would have wine. So who actually destroyed the palace? One of the reasons why it's in such good shape is because it was destroyed and buried almost immediately by the debris from the destruction. As we've said before, our destruction is not so great for ancient people, but for archaeologists, it turns out to be kind of fortunate because plaster preserves, other artifacts preserve well when things are burned. And it turns out that the fire burned so hot in Ebla that the unbaked clay tablets in the palace were baked hard. They were basically they turned into fired ceramic and were able to preserve all these 1,000 years later. Who destroyed Ebla? Well, it could have been, we're going to be talking about Akkadian kings next week, like Sargon or Naram-Sin. It could have been the rival city of Mari. People are not exactly sure that because Sargon and Naram-Sin and the rival city of Mari all claim to have destroyed Ebla at one point. So within the palace, they found 17,000 cuneiform tablets, and you can see them lined up here. In the archive room is where they found the majority of the tablets, and in the archive room, you can see here is like essentially the library of the palace, the accounts room essentially of the palace. You can see this is where the shelves were built into the wall to have house the cuneiform tablets, wooden shelves right on the wall. And when the palace was burned, the wood was consumed and all of those tablets fell right down to the ground. This is a reconstruction of what it might have looked like. And so they were kind of stacked like so. So when they collapsed, they fell kind of in like dominoes almost, you can see here, in the approximate areas that they were that they were capped, right? That is the one row of tablets on top of another row that had collapsed beneath it from a lower shelf. And so archaeologists could not only tell what was written on the tablets, but they could also tell what tablets were cataloged with what other tablets. How was the archive organized? So very important information from that. The texts were written in the local language, which was a Semitic language, like modern-day Hebrew and Arabic and Aramaic. Those are all Semitic languages. It's a language family. Eblaite is similar to Canaanite, which is essentially a Western Semitic language found in the Levant, from which Hebrew emerges, as well as some of these other ancient Semitic dialects like Moabite. And Eblaite, they adopted the Sumerian Canaanite script and used it to write their own language. You can see that what they did is sectioned off the tablets into different squares so that the accounts could be easily separated from each other. Now, many of the tablets deal with administration, some with economic activities like trade and production, some with military activities, and then there were also wordless texts that dealt with divination, and then also literary texts as well. The largest group of tablets dealt with textiles that were stored, received by the palace, or distributed. These were typically used for trade of other items. There's also a room with styluses, which is probably where the scribes sat and worked. Another hall with texts concerning food rations for all the people that worked for the palace. And they also found a room with large quantities of lapis lazuli. This is that beautiful blue stone that only comes from Afghanistan. Ebla was on the east-west trade route that connected the lapis sources to the Mediterranean. So they were tapped into this trading system. And you could see in one area of the palace, they found 22 kilograms of unworked lapis, which would be worth quite a lot. The lapis was probably going to Egypt. The Egyptians wanted lapis. People in southern Mesopotamia wanted lapis. It was highly desired. And we think they were trading with Egypt because they found vases in Ebla with cartouches of pharaohs on them. So the names of specific pharaohs, like Khafre, who built one of the pyramids at Giza. His name is on one of those vases that was found at Ebla. Okay, so it looks like the palace is a very organized, controlled, centralized bureaucracy with thousands of different kinds of officials, artisans, laborers. There's textile production. The king had a herd of 200,000 animals, right? 80,000 sheep. And that's where a lot of the wealth was generated. The king didn't have a lot of agricultural land. Plus, this is a dry farming area, so you can't produce a lot of surplus. But the king was able to call up food surplus as taxes, but didn't actually own the land like we saw in southern Mesopotamia, where palaces and temples had their own property, and the food that was grown on that land went directly to them. A little bit different system here in Ebla. The redistributive economy was ceremonial and personal. What that means is that food and other items were usually given to the people who worked for the temple and others in the context of religious festivals. So that's usually when a lot of this redistribution took place. Another item that we'll look at that was one of the main items that was exported that the people of Ebla specialized in was inlaid wood furniture. Ebla's right near, it's in Syria today, but it's right near Lebanon where those cedar trees grow. And so they had access to this timber, and they were able to take shell and make this beautiful inlaid wood, which they traded to other parts of the ancient Near East. You can also see they had access to gold and were able to manufacture some really nice art. The art, you can also see, is very Sumerian in character. So culturally, they are Sumerian. They believe in basically the same kinds of gods that the Sumerians in southern Mesopotamia believe in. They're writing in the Sumerian script. The art is very similar to southern Mesopotamia Sumerian art. So culturally, they're very, very similar. They speak their own language, and they do have their own particular gods, their own versions of storm gods and things like that. But it's obviously a related culture, an influence from southern Mesopotamia on this region. And you can see depictions of warfare, kind of like we saw in the royal tombs of Ur. So here's a captive being led away by a soldier with, looks like, severed arms as war trophies. Here's someone being killed by another soldier. Someone carrying severed heads, decapitated heads. And you can see a bowman, archer, there. This is maybe what Ebla looked like at the time. So there was peaceful relationships with Mari, but also conflict. So they were trading with Mari. Mari was an important trading partner. There were gifts from the rulers back and forth. And there was trade of the inlaid wood furniture from Ebla. But then there was also military conflict between Ebla and Mari. Not that long ago, a statue of a royal goddess was found in Ebla. They're continuing to make discoveries there, and you can see the gold leaf on this goddess figurine. Okay, so trade was the main source of wealth for the palace, but also private individuals as well traded. That is, you had kind of private merchant class that was developing, and this grows later on, as we'll see in the Old Assyrian, Old Babylonian period. You have a lot of entrepreneurial trade, but we can see the beginnings of that here in Ebla. So for a while, Ebla was under the control of Mari, because Mari was stronger militarily. Ebla allied themselves with southern Mesopotamian city of Kish and defeated Mari, but then Mari actually struck back and defeated Ebla, and that is a time when it's possible that Mari destroyed the palace. At least that's what is claimed. But again, it could have also been Sargon or his grandson, the Ramsin, as we'll learn about. These are tablets from Ebla. I've seen some of these tablets in the Archaeology Museum in Aleppo in Syria. And some of these tablets are like 18 inches on each side, or 24 inches. They're very, very large. I was kind of impressed by the size of the tablets, because I'd never really seen tablets quite as large. Usually the tablets I've seen in museums were fairly small, like a sort of the size of the palm of your hand. And so all of these accounts and receipts and things like that listed here on these tablets, as well as treaties, as we said, word lists and things like that. So here's an example of a treaty between the king of Ebla and another king. Thus says the king of Ebla to Arbasal, "Without my permission you will let nobody travel toward my country. If you let him travel, you have broken your oath. When I order it, they will travel. As to any evil plan you may hear of, you will send a messenger as quick as possible." Right? So, essentially it's sort of a defense treaty in a sense, and also an agreement by this other king not to let people into his territory, and to also relay intelligence that they might have to the king of Ebla. Okay, well, this is where we're going to stop for this week. And next week, we're going to look at how these diverse regions, Ebla and Mari and southern Mesopotamia, were united into one political unit, the world's first empire.